Hello, my name is Alex Rodriguez, and today I will be walking through my digital curation presentation project with you. I'm really excited to reflect on what I have learned this semester. I really learned a lot from this class and enjoyed it. Of course, I'm in your organization of knowledge course as well. Um, and so there's been a lot of overlap, which is fantastic. But again, this is my digital curation project. My name is Alex Rodriguez, and this is for my final project. So, my theme today is that digital curation is active, intentional, and human-centered work. I tried to organize my presentation around key concepts from the quizzes that we had, since they really reinforced the core ideas of the course for each week. And then I'll kind of end the presentation talking about my preservation planning assignment, where I was able to kind of apply these ideas to real life. And so my sort of thesis statement is that digital curation is about long-term access, responsibility, and educated decision making. So then we have quiz one, which was reflecting on digital curation and the OASIS model. So in terms of what I learned here, I learned that digital curation is active management over time, not simply just storing things. That the OASIS model, I call it OASIS, I don't know. OASIS model structures how systems preserve and deliver information. The key takeaway from this quiz and reflection was that preservation requires systems, planning, and metadata. And going forward to use this, I kind of will think about how information moves through systems and not just where it's stored. So, for example, I kind of think about OASIS, like how a system manages something like a thesis. When I upload my thesis, that's like the submission information package. And the system stores it with metadata and the preservation information. And then that becomes the archival information package. And then when someone downloads or views that work later, um, that at that point it's the dissemination information package. So it helped me see that preservation isn't just saving a file, but managing how it moves through a system throughout time. As for our second quiz, which was on appraisal, selection, and authenticity, what I learned was majorly that not everything can be preserved, and for things to be preserved, it requires intentional selection. That authenticity requires forensic copying and integrity checks. The key takeaway would be that preservation is about, again, decision making, not just saving everything. We have to be intentional about how we're doing these things so they can be found and located and stored appropriately. And going forward, I know that I have to evaluate the value, risk, and the feasibility before even preserving the materials. So, for example, when I think about appraisal and selection, I kind of realize that you can't preserve every single file. Let's say from my grad school experience, I wish I could save every research paper and every assignment. But realistically, we have to be, a little bit smarter than that. But we have to prioritize certain things and what we're going to preserve. So I might preserve final papers or, my thesis project, any sort of important research that I know I can refer to in the future. But that's why programs like Zotero are great. So you don't need to actually, store the files on your computer, but you can kind of have them in that sort of cloud where you can access them from different computers. So same thing with a Google Drive is a great place so that you don't have to overwhelm your computer. And then if something happens to your computer, you have a backup, right? Which is a big thing that we learn to prioritize in this class. As for authenticity, it's not really about just saving the file, but you want to make sure that it hasn't been altered, which is where things like forensic copies or metadata come from to verify the original version. A simple way that I can think about this is kind of like your camera roll. You have thousands of photos, you take thousands of photos, sometimes you just spam the button. But you can't save all of them. It would be messy. It makes it hard to find the photos that you actually like or want to keep, or when you go to find them later, they're in the mix of all these other photos. So you have to be, again, intentional about how you're storing things, what you want to store, and why. But yeah, long term can't store everything. You want to select the good ones. And then for authenticity, it's like the difference between having the original photo versus a screenshot or an edited version of the photo. And I definitely feel that because, yeah, I hate when someone sends me like a screenshot of the picture or they edited the picture and then they sent it to me and now I can't edit it. And it's like, I want the original copy. So that's kind of what I think of here. As for the third quiz, we were talking about access barriers and metadata extraction. So what I learned was that encryption in file systems can block long-term access, and that metadata, both technical and descriptive, supports preservation. The key takeaway here was that access is not guaranteed, even if the file still exists. Going forward, I have to think about accessibility and documentation from the start, right? So making sure that you have even different forms of the file. Okay, so a PDF, you may also want the Word doc so it's editable, but thinking about also where you're saving these things and how long these things can be preserved as well. But another way to think about it is thinking about like password protected files or accounts. So like if I have a document saved and it's encrypted, but then I forget the password, the file exists, but I can't access it anymore. So preservation isn't just about keeping a file, but making sure that you can actually open the file in the future. The same idea kind of applies to file systems. If I move files from one system to another, like from Mac to Windows, sometimes things don't transfer properly, and certain files won't open. So even though the data is there, it becomes limited. I even think about trying to copy and paste notes from a Google Doc into a Word document. You have to reformat the whole thing. But yeah, if you can, password protect and encrypt and all of these things with your files, but if you forget the information or you don't have the information that you need to access the file, it's there, but it's not usable. And at that point, we've kind of lost the plot. So moving on to our fourth quiz, which was preservation metadata using premise and METs. What I learned was that premise tracks preservation actions, METs organizes and packages digital objects. So the key takeaway is that metadata works behind the scenes to make preservation possible. Going forward, I'll be sure to value metadata as infrastructure, not just description. So I started thinking about these systems as what's going on behind the scenes when a file is preserved. So for example, if a digital photo is stored in a repository, premise would track things like when the file was created, if it migrated to a new format, or if any changes were made over time. Then METs would act like the container that organizes the photo along with all of the metadata and shows how everything is connected. So premise is kind of like the record of everything that happened to a file, almost like its history, whereas METs is more so the package or what packages everything together so the system knows how to file and the metadata related to and how they relate to each other. So premise tracks the preservation actions and METs organizes the structure of the digital object. Moving on to quiz 5, which was on risks and preservation strategies. What I learned was digital materials are fragile. Strategies include redundancy, migration, and format choice. The key takeaway was that just because something is digital or stored digitally or stored in the cloud does not mean that it is permanent. So going forward, we want to prioritize backups and sustainable formats. So backups in multiple formats, so that if you do move from a Mac to an HP, or if you do go from a Google something to a Microsoft Office or whatever, making sure that um, before it's too late that we are backing things up. So example for me was for my first master's degree, I was about halfway through working on my thesis on an HP computer and it got stolen. Someone broke into my car and stole it. And that had everything related to my thesis, my notes, my research, my drafts, documentation, and horrible, horrible. And everyone was like, oh my gosh, why didn't you have a backup? And that's a great question. It's something that you typically think about after the fact that we need to really, really need to think about prior. And so after that, I ended up getting a Apple laptop, which not a huge fan, but I liked the idea that everything would automatically be stored to the cloud in case I forgot to do a backup. But now I have multiple hard drives and different computers, and I put it in a Google Drive, and I make sure that everything's in multiple places. I use Zotero, but we still have to understand that those things are not permanent. But the more formats and the more, places and types of ways that spaces to put to back things up in different formats. The more that we do that, the more safe our digital data is. So yeah, so when I yeah, whatever. So I was just saying that when I lost my thesis, my computer, it showed me that redundancy is an important strategy, keeping files in multiple places, cloud storage, external drives. If you have older files on your computer as well, we need to think about, was that saved on an outdated system? And should we maybe transfer those files before the system is too outdated to even be able to retrieve or transfer those? I guess I think about a floppy disk. I'm sure I could go somewhere to extract the data for a floppy disk, but I don't have any computers right now that I could just insert a floppy disk into and retrieve that data easily. So yeah, it's a backup, but again, if we can't access that backup, the value is lost. So even if the file exists, it might not open anymore, which is where strategies like format migration become important. Moving on to quiz 6, we had data and confidentiality. Here, what I learned was that data sets require structure and documentation, and that confidentiality requires removing identifiers. The key takeaway is that preservation has to balance access and privacy. So going forward, keeping in mind is ethical handling of data, especially in research. Going through, again, a master's degree where I did a master's in sociology, I had to write a research paper, a thesis. We had to do a lot about ethics and code of ethics when it comes to research, going through the whole IRB process. Um, but yeah, it was just interesting to think about in terms of balancing. I'm even thinking about a patron wanting to access or use the computer at a public library. We want to make sure that they have access, but also that we're only collecting information that's necessary. Not only that, but that the person who's using the computer should be aware of what information is being stored by those public computers. So I think just educating people about that in general can really help with privacy on both ends. And then moving on to quiz 7, which was preserving software. What I learned was that some digital content depends on specific software environments, and that strategies include emulation, migration, and documentation. My key takeaway was that sometimes you need to preserve the environment, not just the file. So going forward, I need to consider dependencies when preserving digital content. This one was, I remember when I wrote my paper on this one, I might have talked about how I'm a bit of a gamer. And not only am I a gamer, but I'm really into retro gaming. So I don't know how familiar you are, but I have like a Nintendo 64, I have a couple GameCubes, I have an original PlayStation, I have the original Xboxes, right? And you have to upkeep them as they're old. But there's a lot of things on those systems that you can only do on those systems, and you can't really extract or transfer that somewhere else. Typically, if we're to use like Xbox, for example, I'm looking over at my games. If I'm going to use Xbox, for example, sometimes things are backward compatible. So, for example, I could take an Xbox 360 game and I can put that into the newer Xbox One console, and it might be able to read that. It won't work for all games, but for some. And yeah, so some games you might be able to put into a newer system and it's backwards compatible, but I have a lot of games that can only be played on an Xbox 360. So I would lose all of that if the Xbox 360 were to die. We call it the red ring of death when it starts to overheat. Once that happens, any of the data that you have stored on there, unless you go to a store for them to maybe try to salvage it, you can't do it yourself at home. It becomes more complicated. So for me, I do prioritize preserving the environment, preserving these older retro video game consoles so that I can play these really old games, these classic nostalgic games on the console that they were meant to be played on. And it's really cool to me. So when I think about preserving the environment, not only do you need the game, but you need the console to play the game on. And once that falls apart, you kind of lose everything that you've had there. So you need to kind of be proactive about preserving those things and be aware, oh wow, if I ever want to play this game again or access these files again, I need to preserve the environment of which they belong. Um, so whatever, older games, certain games for certain systems that are specific, you can't just open and play them on all newer devices. So that's where different strategies kind of come in. Like emulation would mean recreating the original system so the game can still run. Migration would refer to converting or updating the content so it could work on a newer system, and not always possible with gaming. And documentation would be making sure that we record things like what the system or software needs or what the software system we need is so that people know how to access it in the future. For example, you can only use or open this file if you have a MacBook, right? And making sure that we're clear about that so people know what they need to be able to access the appropriate file. And then we have I mixed kind of quiz 8 and the preservation planning project in general, because they were very similar. But so, yeah, my final kind of essay was on preservation planning. What I learned here was that preservation requires ongoing planning and decision making, that we must consider resources, tools, and long-term access. Digital preservation becomes real, and you can very much see the importance of it when you think about things in your own life and what you want to preserve. I even think about going back to preserving environment and files and passwords and encryptions. I think about, my old iPod touches when Apple first came out with the iPod Touch. Oh my gosh, I probably have so many iconic pictures from like middle school and high school, but I forget the 4-digit code. And I think at this point, the only way to open that iPod Touch would be to literally wipe it clean. So these are things that I want to share with my friends and my students as well in terms of thinking ahead of time. Unfortunately, I do feel that sometimes it can be one of those situations that you don't really understand the severity or weight of it until it impacts you, until someone does, steal your whole computer, until someone steals your hard drive, until you realize, oh, wow, I can't play this game anymore, or open this file anymore because I don't have the software anymore or the appropriate environment, or wow, I should have put this on a Google Drive or in a cloud somewhere so I can access it from different spaces. So I think I'll find a cute way to kind of make maybe a one pager with tips and tricks about digital preservation for my students and for, friends, just to be like, these are the important steps to take before something bad happens. So so I do think this content is really relevant for everybody, not just people in library and information science, of course. So yeah, risks of not preservation planning includes, device failure, format obsolete, and then account loss. If you forget the password to your email and you don't have a backup, oh man, you just lost years probably of information, documentation, and correspondences. So when they tell you to do a backup email or a backup phone number or a security question, do that, right? So other strategies that I propose that I've talked about are, multiple backups, both cloud and physical, format migration, PDF, JPEG, making sure that things can transfer and that you save them in multiple formats, better organization and password management, like I said. So my key takeaways here are that preservation is largely a continuous process that we need to be consciously thinking about ahead of time and actively. It's not just a one-time thing. And the other thing I'll say is that, your digital life is quite fragile. It just feels permanent. These things feel so permanent. You're looking at the file right now, you think you'd have access to it forever. You're not thinking about in 20 years when your computer won't work anymore. We do need to think like that. Going forward, I would just say I'll approach preservation as strategic and evolving. It's, I have this information right now and I have these strategies that I'm proposing right now, but as technology develops and improves and progresses, we'll need to continue to adjust the way that we want to approach preservation planning. We're going to have to learn the new technology, the new systems to save this data, to transfer this data, to migrate it. And we need to make sure that we're kind of keeping up on that knowledge so we're staying relevant as librarians, as people serving the community, and for ourselves, for our own protection of our own digital life, and privacy and files, whether that is a thesis paper or family pictures from when you were a child. So I do think that this information is relevant and important for all. So again, thank you so much for a fantastic class. I really appreciated it, and your patience and kindness is just appreciated. So yeah, my overall conclusion, thank you again. Preservation has to do with technology, decision making, and responsibility. From these assignments, I learned that digital information doesn't preserve itself. We need to preserve and manage it, right? Especially if you're going to archive work, this is really important. And going forward, I will be more intentional about how information is preserved, accessed, and sustained over time. With that, thank you again for listening to my presentation, and I hope that you enjoy your summer. Thank you again.